They're only listening for the
They're listening for the Marxism. Nobody cares about us. I was cracking.
We care.
I care. I care about you, Dan. And that's what I'll say. I was cracking up, making myself laugh earlier today because I was like just thinking about how you and I spend usually between like half an hour and an hour catching up before we start recording, and then like we'll start recording, and one of us will be like, "So how are you doing?" And we'll be like, "Good." Because you spend like an hour being like, "Fucking God, oh my God, this and then this."
Yes.
Then it's like, "Oh, good."
Yeah. Well, we have to do that hour of like bitching and moaning so that we can like convincingly say, "Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, I'm fine."
Yeah, now I'm good. Yeah, I've got it all out. I'm fine. Things are going swimmingly.
Otherwise, the audience wouldn't know and they would worry for us. But please don't worry. We have one.
I'd like some sympathy. I'd like a little bit of sympathy. Don't worry about Dan. By all means, send your sympathy my way. I'll take that. No, things are fine. Things are actually fine. Just a bit mad.
It's worth banking that sympathy, though.
Bank it. Oh yeah,
bank it up. Sure. You never know when it's going to be needed.
Dan.
Well, we're fine.
We're fine. We're all fine.
Yeah. Still here.
I think you and I have kind of maybe done a little bit of like pole switching because this week's reading, I'm sold. I'm fully sold. This is kind of we'll get into it. You want to introduce what we read?
Today we read a very small pamphlet from PM Press, which I've been aware about for a little while. It's a collection of essays by Austro-Marxist Julius Deutsch, with quite an extensive introduction by Gabriel Kuhn, who's like a contemporary, I guess. I don't know.
Who is also Austrian, might we add, I believe.
Okay, I thought, he lived in Scandinavia somewhere, sort of anarchisty type leanings. But anyway, this is called, it's quite a difficult title to process. Antifascism, Sports Sobriety, Forging a Militant Working Class Culture. Yeah, that's it.
That's it.
Yeah. And it's great. Yeah. I've been aware of it for quite a long time, and I'm glad that we I've been hoping that we'll find it, see what it's about.
Yeah, our first foray into Austro-Marxism, which is honestly something just passed me by. Not really something I really knew about. And I think that, like, for reasons that we'll get into when people talk about social democracy, I feel like it ends their conversation usually, unless you're from Austria, it usually ends with the war credits thing, because then everybody's like, why would you pay attention to social democracy anymore? Even though, as we always say, everyone's a social democrat except for me. But like, that's generally where people go. There is the split, you got the Second International, there was the split, never the two meet again. Oh, what was this really fascinating experiment going on in Austria? Don't worry about it. I mean, I honestly just didn't really know too much about it. And the only other thing I'll say before we kind of give like an overview or whatever is that you mentioned that the kind of editor and translator, Gabriel Kuhn, has like some anarchisty leanings. I thought that served this very well. You could definitely tell that he kind of had some anarchisty leanings. And I thought that this kind of Austrian attempt to bridge, or kind of maybe we should say like smooth over the gap between social democrats and revolutionary Marxists, or just revolutionary communists, maybe I should say. I thought it served that history well to be written about by an anarchist. Because especially in this experiment, this Austrian experiment, there's kind of some crossover. There's kind of some really interesting crossover in ways that you wouldn't expect the social democracy to kind of, have. Does that make sense? I can't think.
Yeah, it feels like, I mean, I'm not hugely familiar with the history. My only context for this is this essay, this piece. Maybe this sort of gives the false impression, but it almost feels a bit like all of the contradictions of the entire left spectrum, from like reformist social democracy all the way through to potentially even like tactics and politics that are might be more readily associated with anarchist politics, all seem to be like wrapped up in one very contradictory bundle in the form of like Austrian social democracy. I'm sure there were people on different portions of the political spectrum within that party. There was clearly it was a party that had different political wings, I suppose. But yeah, it does feel like everybody's a little bit for everybody. Everything's all of the familiar left wing political tropes are sort of like represented in some way in this political movement, I guess.
Yeah, and just I guess like a brief history by people who have, you know, only really come across this stuff in other references and in this short book.
Yeah.
I guess it's basically just, you know, social democracy in Austria pre-World War One had an influence, certainly like not a small influence. Obviously, we're talking about the Austro-Hungarian Empire before that, with in the wake of World War One, with obviously the Austro-Hungarian Empire being on the losing end of that war. Empire gets broken up. Austria is kind of trying to figure out what exactly Austria is, who they are, and social democracy, the SDAP, the party in Austria, the Social Democratic Party in Austria, has a huge influence on the governments post World War One, all the way up until the kind of brief civil war that broke out / kind of coup, where the fascists took control in 1935 or something like that, in and around that year, 33, 35, something like that. 34, split the difference. And yeah, this is just the reason that this version of social democracy is so interesting is, I suppose, well, Gabriel Kuhn kind of makes the points that whereas the period that we're talking about post World War One in the rest of continental Europe, and the rest of Europe, I guess, the split between social democrats and communists had already happened. You know, when we talk about Germany, we talk about the voting for war credits and, you know, that just being one thing too far. We talk about the German Revolution, all of these different things. That was kind of, you know, that caused a massive split between communists and social democrats, but that split didn't actually exist in Austria. And in Austria, the party, through some good measures and through some kind of questionable ones, was able to keep both radical revolutionaries and social democrats, as we kind of imagine them now, under the banner of one party, to pretty like astonishing results. Like, I forget the guy's name who was, you know, really involved in the kind of arrangement of the SDAP, but he was a self-described social democrat, and he was someone who went as far as assassinating one of the big military leaders in the government during World War One, was imprisoned for it, and then later let out after the end of the war, went right back to social democracy organizing. And he was tried. A lot of the kind of like pro-Soviet communists that existed in the country tried to get him. They're like, dude, you're clearly a radical. Why are you a social democrat? Why are you in this party? And he was like, because this is actually what social democracy is. You're not communists, you're Sovietists, basically, right? It was this kind of really fascinating moment where I was like, wow, we're dealing with a pretty different movement here than what I had previously just imagined social democracy could be. My views of social democracy are kind of painted by a lot of what we've read recently, which is like Rosa Luxemburg, the debates going on within the SPD in Germany, and of course with like, you know, the Labour Party and stuff like that in the UK. But the SDAP in Austria really represents a pretty fascinating attempt, and I think kind of successful attempt, to kind of bridge that gap, maintain a revolutionary stance and organizing for revolution while clearly trying to build something better, practically and slowly, in terms of a movement in Austria. Is really, really kind of changed what I think social democracy could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that like in this they talk about the phrase Austro-Marxism being coined in the 1907, I think, but not really being taken up into common usage. But I mean, I probably knew this and had forgotten, but I think in this essay it said that both Karl Kautsky and Rudolf Hilferding were from Austria, like had a huge amount of contact with well, they're basically just described in this essay as Austro-Marxists, and to some extent, I guess, like what we think of as pre-war social democracy could seems to have been created or modeled in a lot of ways, or gestated in sort of on the Austrian left, I guess. Yeah, I like it's. I feel like, from my limited understanding, the way sort of Austro-Marxism and this period of history have gone down in history, or have been interpreted by people on the left of politics. Like, I think some people are incredibly critical of it, and I think you can take a very critical reading. In some ways, I don't want to play down the extent to which you could fairly criticize the like sheer reluctance to cause any kind of split. Like, that's one of the, I guess in some ways, like one of the hallmarks of sort of Austro-Marxism post World War One is, above all things, to avoid any kind of a split. And I know this is quite a short essay, so it's quite hard to come away. I've not come away with the fullest understanding of what the politics of this era were. Obviously, there was a period of time in the 20s where the Social Democrats won national elections. Their biggest achievement in Austria, I think, is winning the municipal elections in Vienna and inaugurating the era of what's become called Red Vienna, and the sort of like almost like utopian social democratic reforms that were put into place. The legacy of which still exists, to my understanding, in the sort of architecture of the city and the sort of nature of some of the municipal buildings and sort of like council housing, to use a British term, I suppose. But it was so much more extensive than that, sort of like sort of reforming healthcare and providing municipal services and that kind of thing. So there's sort of like but it's hard to interpret that, I suppose, as like, is this sort of like, in some ways that's representative of, maybe that's representative of the best aspects of the reformist impulses of social democracy. But as the history of that era develops, reading this, it becomes very apparent that like the desire to avoid a split in the social democrats in Austria sort of like demonstrates them. It leads to them, I think, papering over certain contradictions, and then the reluctance to be the trigger for what is, it seems, quite an inevitable social conflict or civil war that is coming. They really don't want to trigger that, and it leads them to make certain political and military decisions that one could quite rightly be very critical of. And one could then say, well, does that stem from the nature of Austro-Marxist politics, that desire to paper over the differences, to ultimately not represent a politics which is sort of like militarily anti the sort of bourgeois status quo in some respects, but is like, I guess, reformist would be the best way to describe it. So, yeah, I have a very sort of like, I feel very contradictory feelings toward it, I suppose, but fortunately, I don't expect myself to come away with the fullest understanding from reading 50 pages or 100 pages. So it's fine.
Yeah, thankfully, we don't have to be the ones to make a decision on when to send the Schutzbund in.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to kind of point to that, the like phobia of partition, I think is what it's called in one of these essays that Gabriel Kuhn writes, where it's like their biggest fear in that party was, as you say, splitting. And you can kind of say, fair enough. You can kind of say this is a brand new country. This is a country that's very clearly kind of like how before the French Revolution, there was Paris and then there was everything else. This is kind of like there was Vienna and then there was everything else. There was Vienna and then there were the reactionary peasants and there were, kind of like the church and there are all of these kind of crazy things. And I do think that you're right to basically say that that papering over of a lot of the contradictions that probably did exist led to a kind of ossification where structurally it just kind of couldn't act when it wanted to. And it was afraid of, as you say, starting the Civil War, which in hindsight, we can say, obviously the Civil War was going to happen. They're like, the fascists were openly organizing to overthrow the government. There was a point where there was a small scale rebellion where they were like, basically there was, some sort of event in town. Fascists showed up, shot a bunch of workers. Thousands and tens of thousands of workers showed up the next day to protest against the government. Probably should have been when they sent in, and we'll get to what the Schutzbund is here in a second, probably when they should have sent in the Schutzbund to just start the Civil War. They decided not to. Later on, when the kind of number one fascist in Austria, whose name is, I think, Engelbert Dollfuss, basically locked everybody out of the parliament houses and said, no, we're going to do fascism now.
Very twirlable moustache, I imagine.
No, I
have no idea.
Engelbert Humperdinck. When he locked everybody out and said, we're overthrowing the government now, Social Democrats just kind of went, damn, well, we tried. And, Julius Deutsch writes a lot about this because he was involved in all of these decisions at a really high level. And Gabriel Kuhn does a really good job of giving you source material where Deutsch, in the months and a couple of years following, massive, arrests and killings of all of the people who were fighting against the fascists in this very short civil war that did wind up happening because the fascists decided now is the best time to do a civil war. Julius Deutsch at first kind of defends their actions and is like, we couldn't be the ones to be seen as starting a civil war. But then years later, he's kind of like, we should have been the ones to start the Civil War. That was a massive mistake. Holy shit, World War II, what a disaster. But, with historical hindsight, we can also say, sure, you should have done that. But I was just kind of thinking then Vienna just would have been like Guernica before Guernica, you know what I mean? That would have been where Hitler sent the Luftwaffe to test it instead of Basque country, in Spain. So like, Austria might have been kind of screwed from day one with this stuff, but we can certainly point to these kind of like structural issues within the party that probably did lead to an inability to make these radical decisions. But having said that, I don't know how you build an organization so that it's primed to just start a civil war at the correct time. That seems like an unanswerable question. I suppose you could say radical democracy because it's like the people were ready to do it. They were ready to like kick out all the fascists and start, the workers' government or whatever. Yeah, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah, one only has to look at the history of Russia in 1917 to see that it's all very ad hoc and there's quite a lot of luck involved and like knowing when to act and when not to act. It's quite easy to make the wrong decision or make the right decision, it's not. But it does the interpretation that I've come away with, right, is that like both the Social Democrats to some extent and also some of these organizations, the sports organizations and paramilitary organizations, the Schutzbund in particular, and the Social Democrats to a certain extent clearly as well, set themselves up as defenders of the Austrian Republic. But it sort of feels like they don't see the threats coming, right? So like they don't see that it seems like in some of those cases that you described, for example, like in 1933 when the Austrian fascists are intending to have prevented Parliament from meeting, like not recognizing that you kind of have to define what the correct political stance may have been to actually decide, okay, it's for us to define what it means to defend the Republic, rather than like accepting some objective definition of like, we're not necessarily defending this constitution. But there's a point in this where Gabriel Kuhn quotes from the Austrian Social Democrats political platform, I think, where they're talking about defending the Republic up until the point when it's threatened, but then if sort of like a peaceful democratic transition to socialism is prevented, then they would be willing to like institute a sort of democratic workers dictatorship, like the dictatorship of the proletariat. It seems like contained within their constitution is like a desire primarily to engage in a reformist politics in good faith with other members of or other representatives of different political factions and parties and different political actors in Austria, thinking that they can, they're all sort of like willing to play with the same Republican rules, but they're unwilling to recognize the point when their avowed desire to defend the Republic is they need to act on that kind of thing, rather they're fearful of being the thing that triggers its collapse, not really recognizing, I suppose, that like triggering the collapse and defending it could be the same thing, right?
Yeah, and also like, I don't know, this just gets in, there's a bit of a discussion in here about how there was just a complete lack of any kind of positive aim with the social democratic movement. And it's like, hey man, they built great stuff with what they had, but when it came to defining what this positive aim of what socialism is, you know, stop me if you've heard this one before, they didn't have it. They didn't know what it was. And they might have told you it was something like Hilferding. They might have told you it was something like a cartel or just more public ownership, better working conditions. You know, obviously that's not it. And I mean, you know, we kind of harp on this a lot, but it's like most ideologies, Marxist, socialist, anarchist, whatever, really kind of at the end of the day aren't super concerned to me, it seems like, with what communism actually is and what a working political economy of that society would look like. And it kind of seems like, man, if you're like running a Marxist political party, you should probably have that figured out, because like otherwise you are going to balk at any kind of class struggle that would actually get you there. You're going to balk at any kind of like, not just a civil war, you're going to balk at like actually handing power to the Soviets, right? You're going to balk at anything that would actually represent this, because it I don't know, it isn't really good enough to just say it's a classless society, it's a society of free and equal producers. So how does that work? Like to me, it seems like the number one job of social democracy should be to figure out how that works. And you know, I mean, we get a definition of in here that was, I think, slightly different to the one that we saw in Rosa Luxemburg about what social democracy actually is. Julius Deutsch writes that social democracy has two major duties. First, it has to make the working class understand that class struggle is everywhere. And second, it must, and this is the crucial part, teach the working class how to be victorious in the class struggle in order to abolish all classes and to establish a classless society. And I think for the most part, like they kind of succeeded in those goals in terms of figuring out how it is that you kind of communicate to people that class struggle is all around you, and how you communicate to people how it is that they're going to succeed. But when they just say the classless society, it's like, it just isn't good enough. Like you really actually, you kind of do have to have at least something like a political economy of communism figured out. Because like at the end of the day, otherwise you're just going to be one of these sects that just bangs the drum about a classless society, and all of the different strategic things that people bicker about how to get there just wind up being meaningless. You know what I mean? It's like you can take a look at any Trotskyist sect now, or like any, I don't know, all the way over to like anarchism, ultra left things, and it's just like it's kind of just all the same kind of vagaries, right? And I think that's one of the main things, other than this kind of, you know, structural inability to act. It's also a kind of structural inability to kind of theorize what it is that you're actually getting at. You know what I mean? Because it's not just going to happen. Even if you start the Civil War, it's not just going to happen. You know?
Yeah. I wonder whether then we should sort of move on to some of the content of this. The motivation, I think, of bringing these texts together and focusing on Deutsch in particular. He seems like a really interesting figure, because like in the biography that's given at the end of this book and in some of the quotes from his autobiographies, like he readily admits that like when he met with and was in circles with some of the sort of like most erudite thinkers on the social democratic left through the sort of first and second decades of the 20th century, and sort of readily admits that he sort of never matched up to that level of like in an intellectual space. But what he was incredibly charismatic as a sort of purveyor of these ideas. He was very much the reason why he can write about all of these institutions. He was basically in all of them, right? Like he was like the head of most of these social or cultural institutions, or related to them in some way or other, like his association with working class sport. In this, there's a little piece where I think it's Kuhn talks about a sort of 14-year-old Julius Deutsch like approaching one of the most significant figures of Austrian social democracy and like trying to convince him why forming a working class football club for like the people at some working class association that he knows is like really important, and because he's got this really got a sort of like deeply working class background, he sort of knows the working class very well, and is a good propagator of these ideas, I suppose. But the point in bringing these essays together is to sort of demonstrate the importance of not just like political education, but how to recognize that socialist movement and the social democratic movement was like a cultural movement as well, and sort of like reached quite deeply into culture. And then it sort of raises the question of like the social democrats' efforts to like forge a new forge a working class culture, forge a new working class culture, and in that process like forge a new human being, forge a person that could be the sort of foundation for the future socialist society, I guess. Yeah, I don't know.
Which sounds slightly fascist.
Well, yeah, I mean,
stuff in this where it's like,
yeah. Well, this is. I mean, like, to like, to Gabriel Kuhn's like great, like I laud the way that he writes this essay, his essay, and presents these essays of Deutsch's in a very kind of like non-judgmental way, accepting the contradictions that do exist, inviting readers to like engage with different aspects of this in different ways, because one could certainly read this and, as you say, like recognize sort of an authoritarian tenor to a lot of what's being argued by Julius Deutsch, for sure.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because this is the stuff about Austro-Marxism that I really love and that I think is really refreshing and unique, especially coming from social democracy or the social democratic background. But it's also the stuff where you're a little bit like, like we'll talk about what it is first, and then we'll kind of get to some criticisms. I mean, the main idea basically behind what makes Austro-Marxism so interesting is that they completely reconceptualized the workers' movement as a cultural movement, or they attempted to, right? And they kind of just really saw, I think, quite clearly that you're not going to get very far just talking about labor and economics. Like, unfortunately, you're just not, especially not in times where in downtimes where you kind of need to be building a working class movement, right? So Deutsch wrote in one of these essays, he says, the workers' movement of this era did not simply see itself as a factor in daily politics. Far from it. It wanted to be more, much more. And in the minds of the workers, it was. The goal was to transform all aspects of society and, as a precondition, recreate the individual. And then kind of one of these teetotaling anti-alcohol guys later on says, it is not welfare from above that helps the workers, but whatever enables them to create a humane existence by their own doing. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of at least what the goal wound up being, right? Which is that, well, let me just back up a little bit first and say, I don't necessarily think that this was just some theoretical big brain moment where the Austro-Marxists went, this is what would get people to be interested. I think they clearly tried organizing along typical socialist and socially democratic lines, and it wasn't particularly working as well as they'd hoped. And they especially wasn't working with kind of like young people, with the youth, right? And so they realized, okay, well, young people aren't coming to our meetings if all we talk about is trade unions, but young people will start coming to our meetings, and they did start coming to their meetings if they started talking about sport and sobriety, which is kind of funny. We'll get to that. And, hiking clubs. And if the parties started doing things that working class people were actually interested in and organizing structural spaces for them to engage in these activities, which were socialist hiking groups, socialist sobriety circles, the Schutzbund, which I think deserves kind of a bigger mention, and we'll get to that, which is basically like something approaching a paramilitary of the left. And, socialist Olympics that ran alongside the actual Olympics, self-help kind of things, mutual aid, help after natural disasters. And yeah, that is all just to say that I think this is a pretty big advancement in social democracy, which is to say it isn't a workers' movement, it's a cultural movement. And, you can even theorize like the culture, it includes the modes of production that we inherit from earlier generations, right? We adapt those kind of in ways that we don't necessarily intend. They adapt us and change us in ways we don't necessarily intend. But if you are trying to, I think, build a workers' movement, quote unquote, especially in times where there aren't just people creating Soviets because times are so bad or going on bread riots. The best way to do that is to actually create a cultural movement. And whether or not you kind of buy the bullshit about like discipline that they talk a lot about in here, or the bullshit about like what it is that makes a worker a good worker, I don't think you should necessarily buy that stuff. I think there's a lot to be taken from the idea of the movement towards the class of society as a cultural one. And I think this is something that is not just interesting from a historical perspective, but is probably a missing piece in a lot of left organizing today. Like, when we talk about anarchist stuff, we kind of laugh because it's kind of like, wow, it turns out the best way to help working class people is to like help working class people. When you talk about mutual aid, it's like, wow, people listen to you when you're actually trying to help them. Here, it's like people listen to you when you give them an opportunity to engage in activities they want to engage in. You're never going to get a million people to show up to your reading group. You're never going to get a million people to listen to your fucking podcast. The best way to do it is to be like, what is it that people want around here? And to somehow make those socialist, which they did by making it part of the party, more or less, which has its own issues, which we'll get to. But that is all just to say this stuff I thought was very, very cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it speaks to, I mean, we've talked about some of this before, right? And like the origins of particularly the working classes organizing their own sports clubs, social clubs, hiking clubs, cycling clubs, whatever, goes back into the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, and sort of like was evident all across Europe. Although apparently it would seem that it did reach a sort of like high water mark in the German-speaking countries, particularly in Austria, particularly in this period, so like the Austro-Marxists were clearly doing something very specifically right in the field of like recruiting and organizing or offering not just political and economic, but cultural offerings to the working class of Austria that was appealing and drew people in. Now, I guess it's probably fairly obvious to say that like this is a unique circumstance that like doesn't translate particularly to our current setting, right? Like there was a huge number of things that the working class was excluded from, sort of like excluded from participation in sport and various activities, whether by cost or by sort of class exclusion or whatever. And also the sort of like, this is a transition from sort of like 11-hour working days to 10 to 8, and this sort of like flourishing of more free time. But you articulate it very well. Like there is a broader question that can be transposed into our current time, which is like, what are people's actual interests and how can they be engaged in that space rather than like through like staid, boring political discussion or 100-year-old debates about whatever, which is our bread and butter, obviously. But
that's what they want. They go, yeah, tell us about these 100-year-old critiques of social democracy, please.
But there is like a, it's hard for me to escape in this. Like the central contradiction of my engagement with this, I suppose, is like asking the question, like, how much of the clearly there was a willingness of the Austrian and the broader like Central European and European working class. There was a broad willingness from them to participate in organizations like this, and a desire to join and grow these organizations and sort of define what they were, I suppose. It's also hard for me to escape a feeling, particularly, I guess, because like what we have is accounts and descriptions that come from the sort of like upper echelons of these organizations. Now, most of the leadership of the Social Democrats were in some ways from a working class background, and they were of the working class, so shouldn't fall into that dichotomy of purely imagining here are some elite intellectuals that are like brainwashing and whatever the Austrian working class. At the same time, maybe it's something to do with the way this is written, or particularly the essays by Deutsch, or like who the audience were for these. I don't know, but like in some ways it's hard to imagine, it's hard to get away from a slight feeling of like, I guess that sort of like authoritarian tenor of this, that we were talking about before, or like, is this just a description, sort of an idealized description coming from a small elite cadre that imagine they can refashion the working class along their own lines if they just create the right institutions? And I guess that's a contradiction that always needs to be reckoned with, but also like the falseness of that as well, right? Like it's a common danger, and one that I sometimes fall into, is sort of imagining the distinction, sort of like the distinction between the rank and file working class and the sort of like elite Marxist intellectual who leads them, kind of thing, which is like not a sort of true representation of the history of this. So
yeah, well, maybe. I mean, as soon as they start talking about sobriety, it starts to get a little bit like, what is the actual goal of these units? When they start talking about militarization, you're on board at first, and then you're kind of like, they start throwing around phrases like ideal workers and transformed into the ideal workers, and it's a little bit like, but I think the contradiction there kind of comes not necessarily from like the Marxist intellectual and the people below them. I think it comes from like the structure of the party necessarily overseen and having its stamp on every aspect of these groups, which is like a critique you'll hear a lot of, social democracy along these lines, which I think is absolutely fair. It's like, man, when they started talking about the kids groups and they had a photo of like the Red Falcons, I was like, this is just fascism. I was like, the logo, all the kids had the same haircut. It was just like, it wasn't the fascist flat top. It was like a bit longer than that, but it was like, I don't know about this. Like, I think on one hand, it's very laudable to try and create a working class culture, but on the other hand, it's incredibly sus when you start to dictate what that actually is. And the sobriety stuff I keep going back to, not necessarily because I'm against people being sober, all for it, in fact, but when you start, the kernel of truth in this stuff is when Julius Deutsch starts talking about how workers are so alienated and exhausted after work, the only thing that they can imagine doing after work is not working, which is to say just going to the bar and getting fucked up with your friends and going to work the next day because you only have one day off, right? And like, there's a lot of that now. There's a lot of like, hey, it's bank holiday weekend, let's just forget half of it, you know what I mean? And like, I think that even though I'm always a little bit suspicious of like Marxist cultural critiques, I think that you very clearly can draw a line where you're like, harmful behavior like that is a result of how alienated everybody feels and how everybody feels like what they do with 70% of their time is really shitty and they hate it. That just leads to a very self-destructive desire. I think that's all absolutely true. It's just kind of like when they tie that into how the ideal worker should act on their immortal crusade to socialism, it's like, it's none of your business. It's absolutely none of your business. And they try to make this argument about like workers should be sober because being a drunk it doesn't just hurt yourself. Julius Deutsch is like, hurt yourself if you want to, but if you're a drunk, you're hurting society. And it's like, okay, yeah, whatever, dude. It's like, I see what they're saying. I see how they think that like iron discipline is absolutely necessary and how they tie that into the struggle for socialism. But at the end of the day, it's incredibly alienating. And I think, again, the way that I'll tie this back into how I started it is that it isn't necessarily a contradiction between elites and workers. It's a contradiction between how the structures that the quote unquote like vanguard, however you want to describe, active socialists, how that structure presents itself and organizes the kind of lower echelons of that system, kind of like the operational theaters, I guess. Like Julius Deutsch in this does kind of talk in very systems theory kind of terms. But I do think he misses the point where it's kind of like, you don't want the dictate of what a good worker is to exist, first of all, but you absolutely don't want it to be coming from above. You definitely don't want it to be coming from the party, to the extent that you probably don't really want the party involved in every aspect of people's lives like they're here, as laudable as the kind of socialist hiking group, socialist bicycle club stuff was. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like, in some ways, like, these texts are just written from the standpoint of, we are the Social Democratic Party. What do we need from the working class? What self-potential? Well, let's admit that all of these things are self-generated from the working class, right? It's still, okay, what are the aspects of this that we like and fit with our conception of what the working class is supposed to do and what we need of them? But also, like, well, there's a few things. One thing that's really missing from this is, and I don't know whether you found it. I don't think it's there. Is any reference to the building of working class institutions so that the working class can go on to run society? Like, none of this is about, like, socialism. All of this is about fighting for socialism, although not defining what that is, or it really just like fighting to defend the status quo so that the Social Democrats can continue their sort of like slow reformist approach to politics and not really reckoning with what might be demanded of them that would be more radical or revolutionary tactics. I guess the other thing to put this into perspective is recognizing the time that they are living in, right? Like, if there is this looming threat of fascism, if they're living in a time of coups and putches and right-wing paramilitary organizations and sort of like bourgeois sporting clubs also organizing themselves into pseudo paramilitary or like wings of other more paramilitary or military style organizations, like, there is a requirement to sort of like meet fire with fire almost. Like, what Deutsch is describing might be political tactics and tendencies that are appropriate to the age in which he's writing. That gives me pause to be like, okay, yeah, well, maybe discipline in this context is good. It's like being able to operate in like pseudo military organizations is a positive in that context. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. I think, that's probably a very important context that we were kind of missing in this discussion, is that this was all framed directly with the struggle against fascism.
But given that they balked at the...
Yeah, well, exactly.
Exactly.
That speaks, I think, exactly to kind of your point, which is that at the end of the day, these were organizations that were set up to kind of maintain the social democracy status quo. And hey, that's a status quo I'd like to live in. You know what I mean? I wouldn't mind living in Karl Marx Hof, which actually, when you look at Karl Marx Hof, Dan, what do you see? What do you actually see? Am I insane or what do you see?
I don't know. I've not looked at it. What does it look like?
Okay. It looks like I'll let you look it up. I'll keep talking until you look it up and tell me what you see. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to actually know because maybe we should talk a little bit about the Schutzbund, because are you looking at it? What do you see? What do you see? It's so obvious to me. The facade.
I just see some kind of like I don't know. What do I see? I see Slanesh all over that.
Okay, see, I see corn. It's obvious that it's corn. It's obviously the symbol for corn. I'm glad you said that.
Oh, which bit are we? Okay, well, I mean, maybe I'm looking at the red brick and you're looking at the white brick. Anyway,
I don't know. I've only seen black and white photos.
No, I'm going to have to anyway.
All I'm saying.
Okay.
Like 100 episodes ago.
On the same page, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
I'm going insane. I'm going a little bit insane. I'm like, it's everywhere. Everywhere I look, I see him. Speaking of corn, Dad, speaking of blood for the blood guard, the Schutzbund. Unfortunately, that's not what the Schutzbund was. We keep hinting at what the Schutzbund was, and other than just being a fun thing to say, this was kind of the organization that represented the militarism of the Austrian Social Democrats. And I kind of balk at calling it a paramilitary organization because it did a lot of other things. And when the rubber kind of met the road, it wasn't really even a paramilitary organization in the kind of broader sense. It put up a bit of a fight, but not much of one. Deutsch kind of introduces the Schutzbund by basically saying that the traditional workers' movement has a real aversion to militarism. And he makes a really interesting point where he is like, the reason for that is because when people think of militarism, they just think of the repressive apparatuses. You know, he doesn't use that term, but he's like, they just think of the repressive apparatuses of the military and the police and all of these horrible things. And they just kind of go, why would we want that to be in the workers' movement? But he basically says what militarism means in, you know, the workers' cultural movement is that it represents the kind of order, discipline, and unity. They're all vital to the cause, blah, 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 blah. Again, kind of bordering on some weird kind of authoritarian shit. But basically, this is an organization that was created to, in theory, when things got bad, defend the workers against the fascists. Probably not even necessarily to bring, you know, the workers' movement to, you know, the goal of socialism, but to be the thing that at least just defended workers. And when I said earlier that Deutsch kind of talks a lot in systems theory kind of speak in a way that I was kind of really impressed with, specifically when he's talking about the Schutzbund, because he makes the point that any human organization, any system, any group that is kind of not keeping itself busy is just going to completely dissolve. And I think that that's a pretty good lesson for people to learn in organizing on the left, because there's so much burnout that goes on that it's just like, you know, if you have a sect and it's just kind of a reading group, it's probably not going to last that long. You know what I mean? Like, function of a system is what it does. And so he says that they kind of recognize that in the party. And so they basically set up these defense units to support all the other workers' organizations. So basically, whenever there was a need for kind of like, you know, an ordered, you know, group to come in and set about achieving a goal, whether that was mutual aid after like a natural disaster, whether that's like setting up strike posts, whether that's defending workers against fascists when they're marching or something like that, security at party things, they would call in the Schutzbund. And it was just basically a bunch of like seemingly sober, kind of like priggish Austrian guys that would show up and just kind of like be visible. That's another thing. He basically says, having guns, having arms, that's completely secondary to what the Schutzbund actually does, which is just be visible and show up and show to the bourgeoisie that, hey, we're actually organized and we can actually kick some ass. He's like, it doesn't really matter if at the end of the day, well, maybe not at the end of the day, it certainly did, but he's kind of like, to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter if you actually have the firepower to do this. If you just show up and you march around and you kind of make yourself look militarized, that's going to kind of, as we see time and time again, just make the fascists melt away. And I don't know. It's cool. It's definitely, I think, a good idea in any kind of workers' movement to have something that is much more disciplined than the kind of typical operational, you know, units, whether that's like bicycle clubs or swimming groups or reading groups or theory classes or something like that. But yeah, this just again gets into the main question of Austro-Marxism, which is this camaraderie or is this kind of groupthink? Like, again, I already bought up the Red Falcons or whatever they were called. That was like, and even the cover of this book, I appreciate how kind of like homoerotic the cover of this book is. It's like a series of men doing some sort of sporting activity. I can't really figure it out, but it's like all have the same haircut. They clearly are all supposed to be this like chiseled worker in a way that like, I don't know. Who cares? Like, who cares if the worker looks like the worker in your mind? You know what I mean? It's like, I'm all for people getting in shape and being healthy if they want to, but like, Schutzbund, huh? I don't know. Discipline. It's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, there's clearly like a uh, they're clearly expecting people to conform to certain norms, certain body standards, certain beauty standards. Even there's certainly a sort of like ableist tenor to all of this, like which um, like at the same time, like recognizing that like um, the working class of Europe had been sort of ground down by capitalism. They've sort of had their bodies destroyed, and they've been fed the opiums of like um, alcohol in particular is the sort of big sort of boogeyman in this, I suppose. But like exposed to incredibly unhealthy conditions, like I don't know.
Julius Deutsch would have loved Wall-E. He would have been like, "This is what I'm saying."
Yeah. I mean, like there is. I mean, I guess like well, there's other things to say about the sports aspect of this, I suppose. In a minute, I mean, and maybe we'll go for it. Why not? Like the sports essay in this is quite good fun. I really enjoy it. Like some of his like criticisms of like bourgeois conceptions of sport, and he really like does a cultural critique of the sort of bourgeois nature of how sport is practiced, and it imagines like a very sort of wholesale revolution of how it's approached. I mean, the cover of this is some kind of like gymnastics exercise, I suppose. And in some ways, it does speak to what they were trying to achieve, which is like moving sport and physical activity away from a celebration of personal records and a reverence for like the particularly successful individual, and more toward like training together for sort of like the improvement of the entire social body, I suppose. Now again, it gets very like that gets away from the individual, and sort of like in some ways could be read as like being only interested in people's like subservience to the collective, I suppose. But like at the same time, it recognizes that people are only able to sort of develop their best abilities through collective endeavor, I suppose, and like fixating on physical activity that people can do together, rather than making sort of like physical prowess something which is like put on a pedestal and only watched rather than participated in. Like I enjoyed it as a sort of like cultural critique, I suppose, as a sort of like engaging with I don't know, like bourgeois physical culture, and like imagining what a proletarian one might be, I suppose.
Yeah, we even talked about this a long time ago when we used to make videos of us sat on that couch talking about things. We talked about what sports would look like under socialism. And yeah, this never occurred to me. I mean, first things first, Julius Deutsch failed to consider Shohei Ohtani's statistical anomaly of a career and how incredible that is. But like, yeah, his point, which is, as you're saying, like the way we engage with sports now is one where we just like fetishize athletic ability and what people earn. And perfect example, two of the greatest baseball pitchers of all time are probably in their last season going into this coming year, and they just signed their contracts, and they've always been they came into the league at the same time, and they've always been kind of pitted against each other. One of them signed like 2 weeks ago for $15 million. The other one signed a couple days ago for $15.5 million, and it's just like, oh my god, like that's so funny. It's a kind of like a good example of what sports is to a lot of people, right? Like obviously I'm not, and Julius Deutsch is not saying there's too much money in sports. The kind of point is more so that like sports is a thing where we look for the hero, just like we, it's bourgeois society in sports. And I think that's fair. And I mean, I think the idea of like the socialist Olympics was awesome, and I knew nothing about that. These Olympics that ran, socialist Olympics that like ran alongside the actual Olympics, where the athletes wouldn't have any flags other than the red flag of socialism, and they weren't actually really competing. They were all in it together. And of course, because it was something on the left wing, it was marred by a split and then fell apart, which is incredibly funny. But like, I don't know, maybe that is what sports would look like. Maybe sports would be something where it's like you're a lot more interested in engaging with it and making everybody else better. Like the idea of an Olympics where like the Olympics now is just so unwatchable because it's like, oh, somebody beat the world record in 100-meter breaststroke by 1/1000th of a second. It's like nobody actually gives a fuck. That's fine. Like the idea of competitions that are more so just about like everybody being better, I think is probably a pretty like it probably is just what sports would look like under socialism. And like there would still be friendly competition and stuff like that, but like I don't know. I really like the picture that you painted of sports. It is just so funny though, because it's like I spend so much of my free time just like scrolling through statistics databases for baseball and just being like, "Wow, nice FIP, like nice X Wobacon."
I mean, I love watching like the most elite of the elite athlete in whatever activity do something so inhuman. It's like it's astonishing kind of thing. And part of me would rather imagine that like socialism will allow everybody to excel and succeed to their greatest ability, and like we in a socialist future as sort of like people who have a say in these things would accept and encourage and enable people to devote all of their time to like achieving the utmost of what they're able, if that is sport, and if we chose and wanted to do that and thought that was advantageous and positive. Yeah, I don't know whether this doesn't go too far in the opposite direction. Like we could probably have like team sport and supporting your team and come away from that not like a violent mob who wants to sort of destroy the opposite fans and or like slipping into or like being enabled to be better chauvinist nationalists just because we like support one team over another or whatever.
I think there will still be violent sport mob behavior in socialism. I think that there probably just still will be, because if anything, like we talked about this a little bit about like how would sports actually work without money? Because it's like, well, you wouldn't just have a franchise that trades players and is kind of just defined purely by your ownership group and their willingness to spend money. There wouldn't be money, right? So it's like you're not trading labor tokens when you talk about players. So it's like I would imagine sports teams would just be regional at that point and like based on neighborhood. And it's like, that seems like that would cause like a lot of hooligan behavior, probably more so. I don't know. I don't actually, there isn't a whole lot of hooligan behavior in American sports.
Maybe they'll just like, maybe they'll just be like, every year there'll be a massive draft. Everybody's made eligible. And then they just pick, like every team just picks.
Or fake money. Or you could just have fake money where it's like everybody gets, I don't know. Market dynamics and nothing except sports.
But it is in reading this book, it is quite hard to imagine what sporting activities these people are actually engaged in. Like when it drills down to it, I'm just like, what's happening in these gymnasiums? And I don't know.
It's swimming where you all like touch the end of the pool at the same time.
Yeah.
Basketball with no hoop or something like that. Just
what
passing.
Can we do in routine together?
Yeah, it'll just be synchronized swimming, maybe.
Yeah, we can go hiking.
Socialist
hiking in the Austrian mountains and
dude,
like
that was the coolest thing in this whole book is when they talk about how there were just like 200 cabins that workers could just use in the Alps. I was just like, fuck yeah, that's the coolest shit I've ever heard. And then they start talking about it. They were like, but then there were the fascist hikers cabins, and it's like, whoa, stay away from those cabins, Jesus. What a crazy time that was, Jesus. How also another funny thing on the sports, how funny was it when they were like the pictures of, I don't know, I think it was like gymnasts or swimmers or something like that, and they were parading through town looking like good little fascist socialists, and their like banners said like, gymnasts will not allow fascism in Vienna. I was like, yes, as long as you have the gymnasts and the swimmers on our side, fascism will not prevail.
Well, I suppose that makes a good point actually about like how integrated all of these organizations were, right? These are not three isolated essays about here are the people in the paramilitary Schutzbund and here are the people doing the hiking and here are the people like in the sobriety temperance movement or whatever. But like, particularly to your point about, or the point made by Deutsch about like in downtime you need to find a way to like keep these organizations connected with one another. I think like it was engagement. It was Schutzbund members' engagement also in sporting groups and organizations like that, and in the temperance movement and other groups like that, which sort of maintained their connectedness through periods where their like services, I suppose, as a purely pseudo military organization weren't required, kind of thing. And the sort of like the degree to which like some of the gymnasiums and sporting clubs sort of almost overlapped into like military training, the sort of separation in some respects seems quite tenuous in a lot of examples in this, I guess. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, discipline. And in a lot of ways, maybe it was just fascism that kept these groups together. Yeah. You know what I mean? It was just like the threat of fascism that made there be socialist parties and stuff.
Yeah, it's a response. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just, the only other thing I would say is like on the kind of discipline thing too. I think when Julius Deutsch writes like discipline is required to overthrow capitalism, he's right to a certain extent. It's just about like I don't know, when they talk about the sports and they talk about the Schutzbund, it's like on one hand they're saying something very literal about why it is that good workers should engage in sports, and it's like it gets you ready for fighting. You join the socialist jiu-jitsu club, it gets you ready to fight the fascists. And it's like, aside from how cringe that is, and like obviously, as you say, like ableist and all the other things that go along with it, it's kind of silly just on its own face. But then they're saying something that's a bit more, not like metaphorical, but it's a bit more not spiritual either. They're talking about nurturing a fighting spirit, which I think is totally fair. And they talk about how go and engage in sports, not just to like physically get your body ready to be a good Soviet citizen for the time that the class struggle comes. It's like, you know, it's a good way of, I don't know, it's like teamwork. It's kind of like you're building connections with people. It's like when you hear cringe socialists talk about how, well, there's no real point in even going to protest, dude, because they're not going to do anything. It's like you're meeting people when you're there and you're forming real connections. That's just as real of an outcome for any of these things, right? Same thing with sports. It's like you're meeting people, you're talking about things, you're engaging socially when you otherwise would just be down drinking schnapps at the pub. You know what I mean? Like when they talk about nurturing a fighting spirit, I think there is part of me that understands that and understands how discipline to a certain extent can be tied into that. It's just, again, about how that relates to the system that it's kind of nested within. And when someone's telling you who you need to be, alarm bells just immediately go off in my head. It's like, yeah.
I mean, like, Deutsch tries to make the argument that like there is a distinction between pure militarism, which is like forced upon people being conscripted into an army, and made to do things because they're like officers and whatever say so, versus like a military styled organization which adopts all the sort of techniques of that are modeled by bourgeois militaries because they're just like the best way to organize that kind of organization for certain ends. But what he's leaning on is an idea that like people are choosing freely to be part of this. They're like gaining a huge amount of association from it. He's hinging quite a lot on that distinction. I guess we could potentially criticize like whether that's a real distinction, whether that's a thing. There are definitely criticisms that are raised of Deutsch and of some of these organizations that like really what they're doing is taking away a lot of the autonomy of workers. Like there could be a lot more democratic organization in these like groups, you know, like is there an alternative way of organizing a sort of like socialist military response to thing? I mean, these are arguments that have had more apt historical moments, like the Spanish Civil War or the Russian Revolution, like these questions of democratic organization of militaries are sort of much more apt in those contexts, I suppose, and throw up much more interesting, perhaps, or like fruitful historical examples, I guess. But
yeah, it's also interesting just how like structurally how the Schutzbund related to the government, because they were basically able to make the argument that no, it's not a paramilitary group because it's it's got nothing to do with the government. This isn't like a government militia, and in a lot of ways it was actually a people's militia. The thought of building a people's militia now is daunting. But I mean, when you do it like this, where it's, you give them things to do and they're just there just in case, and to basically show off to whoever's watching, don't fuck with us, I guess. Fair enough.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's another example of something which would have worked in that era and perhaps is like completely alien to us now, like, when are you ever going to demonstrate to the repressive apparatus of capitalism that you're ever going to be able to match it for sheer ability to deploy violent force? It's just never going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny in this one. It's like, oh yeah, guns are really easy to get hold of. That's not the important thing.
I know, that was really funny.
It's like building the degree of camaraderie and we can easily match their firepower. What we need to match is their discipline. It's like, well,
where do you think? I wonder where he was sourcing those guns. Yeah, I think at one point he might have said Hungary, but it's like, where were they getting guns at this point?
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things. They didn't have enough, unfortunately. Austro-Marxism.
Yeah,
it's worth it.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. I mean, I got a lot of questions, a lot more history to delve into, which I'd love to get to at some point. But I'm glad that we've touched on this, because it's as you say, it does it blurs the image of, okay, there was the split in 1914, and then it didn't continue after. I guess the question for me is did the split reveal something true? Was Austro-Marxism like the high watermark of social democracy, or was it the sort of like the dying last gasp when it was clearly obvious that it wasn't able to meet historical need, I guess? But,
yeah. I mean, again, one wonders, even if they did do the Civil War, one wonders how long they would have lasted with Italy on one side and Nazi Germany on the other side, and Hungary on the other side. So, yeah, grim, sad history, very sad history. Yeah, what else to say about that? It is just interesting that, like, generally when you hear people talk about social democracy, they kind of will just talk about the SPD and not the SDAP as much. But again, I guess it is just for a lot of social democrats, like kind of like McNary kind of types, the question again isn't really about like communism as such. It's more so about like a game theoretical strategizing of what failed and what succeeded. And you can kind of pretty quickly be like, oh, it's the fact that it was just super Big Tent and they just always took the path of least resistance when it came to making any kind of decision ever, and then just got steamrolled because of that. And maybe there's just more of an argument to be had about the SPD as opposed to Austria. What are you going to do? Pick your martyrs, I guess. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's some good ones in this.
There definitely are. Yeah. Well, I look forward to when we fully socialize the Los Angeles Dodgers. They're becoming pretty close to a general cartel, I would say, at this point. So once we get them on board, we get the Bolton Wanderers on board, and it'll all be fine. We'll be set.
Yeah. We'll all take turns playing
GM, socialist GM. I'm volunteering myself for that commissarial role. I'm going to do that right away. Be like, Comrade Otani, your FIP is way up this year. We will be punching you.
Yeah, we're not going to democratize participation in sport. We're going to democratize management of sports teams.
I'm on board.
Disaster.
I'm on board.
Yeah. Armchair quarterbacks.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna boot up out of the park baseball is what I'm gonna boot up. That's what I'm gonna go do. Dan, again, very nice.
Yes.
Very nice to do this.
This exercise.
I feel like we've been saying this at the end of every episode. Next episode, actually, that one will probably come out on time. I imagine that comes out on time.
Okay.
I'll say it now.
Whatever it is.
Whatever it is, it's coming out on time.
Yeah.
All right. Cool, man.
It's been fun.
It's been fun. Thank you, Dan. Talk to you again, hopefully.
Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.